All right, what other prayer needs?
I'll just pray, that that study goes well, that people, that we can all learn from one another, that we can each take something away from it, and that the Lord would continue to bless our congregation and continue to be a blessing to others.
Amen. Anything else from anybody else? All right, Tom, do you want to lead us in prayer?
Right now, I'm still eating, but okay. Father, we thank you again for this day of study to study your word. We thank you for the men here who have really worked to help build up your congregation, the Tikvat Israel of Oahu. We pray that many more people will learn of what Mike and John and Rabbi Daniel are doing and draw them near, that they might have a chance to participate and become part of the congregation. We pray that you'll be with us as we study your word tonight and help us, each of us, to take away what you want us to take away, in order that we might learn to walk closer to you in our days to come. In Yeshua's name we ask this. Amen.
Amen. All right, it's all yours, Mike. Mike?
Sorry, I guess my mic was muted still. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Appreciate everyone signing on here. Let's start with a quick recap of what we went over in week 3. So just last week. So last week we read about the Ammonite plot against the city of Jabesh and how this was really the first test for Saul as king. Now, one of the things we learned from this event is the true importance of quality leadership. One of the things the military teaches about leadership is that every leader has a ton of responsibility. And when you break down the word responsibility, it's a combination of the words response and ability. So a good leader has to be responsive, and they also have to have ability to get things done. What do you think so far in what we've seen in Saul? Have we seen these traits in him yet? What do you think?
I believe so.
Well, I would say yes and no. For the first part, being responsive, I think when he was, chosen and anointed to be king, he wasn't very responsive. He was hiding in the supply closet, right? Right. But then once he was back home on the farm and he learned about the Ammonites, rising up against Jabesh, he was extremely responsive. Right. And we see that he didn't really have much ability on his own yet, and that's why he sent such a inspiring message to all the towns and villages in Israel to encourage them to send able men to join the army. So I think we've seen it go both ways. Well, we also discussed how Saul's second coronation after the victory at Jabesh served as the official transition of power and authority from Samuel to Saul, and the official transition from the time of the judges to the time of the kings. And up to this point, even in the battle, Samuel was right there with Saul, right beside him. But now Samuel's going to hand the reins over to Saul for good. So let's continue. Let's continue in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Let me pull it up here. All right. right. So here in 1 Samuel 12, Samuel, preaches the entire chapter is his farewell address. And he preaches a really great sermon admonishing the people to be faithful to the Lord under the new king. He also chastised them for not trusting in God alone to rule them and for demanding a king in the first place. He also called them all to repentance for their sins. All right. We're not necessarily going to go verse by verse, but let's start in verse 16 and read through verse 25. Let me pull it up here. So 1 Samuel 12, verses 16 through 25. Can I get a volunteer to read for us, please?
I'll do it.
All right.
Now stand by and see this great thing that Adonai will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest season today? I will call to Adonai that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of Adonai by asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel prayed to Adonai, and Adonai sent thunder and rain that day. Then all the people greatly feared Adonai and Samuel. And all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to Adonai your God, that we would not die. For we have added to all our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king. Samuel said to the people, fear not, indeed you have done all this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following Adonai, but worship Adonai with all your heart. Do not turn aside to go after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are futile. For Adonai will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased Adonai to make you a people to himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against Adonai by ceasing to pray for you. Yet I will keep instructing you in the good and the straight way. Only fear Adonai and worship him in truth and with all your heart, considering how magnificently he has dealt with you. But if you persist in acting wickedly, you will be swept away, both you and your king.
That's right. Thank you. All right. So when we read this part, oh, and before I ask the first question, I'll just remind everyone that if you go into the chat function here of this meeting, you'll see that I uploaded the discussion questions for today, as well as the chart that shows the narrative emphasis. And I'll show that in a second, and we can go through that. So if
a quick observation, verse 17 says, isn't it wheat harvest today?
Right.
So what festival of the Lord is during the wheat harvest?
Well, that's a good question. Depending on the species of wheat itself can have it can have 3 to 4 different harvests every year.
I'm just wondering if it was either Shavuot or Rosh Hashanah.
Probably closer to Shavuot.
Yeah.
Rosh Hashanah is the harvest of the fruits.
Well, but there is also wheat harvest in the fall as well. All right, so we just read 16 through 25. First question in the discussion questions, what leadership traits do we see here from Samuel in his address to the people, and what can we learn from his example? What do you think? What leadership traits do we see here from Samuel in this address?
Well, for one thing, he continued to, even though it was a rejection of his leadership, he doesn't take it personally. And he said, I'm going to continue to pray for you. And he continued to admonish the people and stand by the people.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. John, you have any thoughts?
No, just as he's just staying steadfast in what he's been taught all his life. You know,
Sure.
because when he was left in the temple, he was taught by the priest that he lived with, and he's keeping his word and expects everybody else to walk in the same way.
Yeah, that's very true. One of the things that I took away from this was that Samuel wasn't depending on his own strength, on his own power, but or his own influence, right? But he called upon the Lord. Now, this storm that Samuel called out from the Lord was a pretty significant event. It must have been really frightening, right? Because all the people became really scared at the storm, and they had to have recognized it as being supernatural, not just a little shower, right? But it was something more than that, and it was bad enough that they even feared for their lives, right? But Samuel uses this to call them to worship Adonai with all their hearts, and he also reassures them that God would not forsake them if they turn back to God. But he doesn't he doesn't end the message with just this warm fuzzy, right? As we see a lot of days in the modern church, right, where it's all about just making people feel good at the end and just and not calling out sin. He also warns them that they will all be swept away if they continue to act wickedly. All right, so you have some of the leadership here. You see that he's calling upon the power of the Lord. You see that he's calling them to worship God with everything that they have. He gives them reassurance and comfort that they're not going to be forsaken, but also doesn't ignore the sin and gives them the warning of what will happen if they continue to live in sin. All right. Are there any other questions or comments on this portion, or anything about Samuel's sermon here in chapter 12?
Well, I the great thing I've learned is that I'm going to continue to pray for you. I know that he was rejected, but as a leader, I'm still going to continue to pray for you. And I don't remember where, I think it's in Jeremiah or Isaiah, that at one point Israel went too far and God said, don't pray for them, I won't listen to them.
Right, I remember. Yep.
But in this case, say, yes, you have sinned, and yes, you rejected me, but I'm still going to continue to pray for you. And I think that's the greatness of Samuel.
It is, definitely. It definitely is. No, I agree. That's one that I would add in there too, that even though he may have felt some personal slight and disappointment with them at the rejection, he still said, I'm going to stand by you and I'm going to pray for you. That's not the same thing as saying, I'm going to stand by you while the thunder and lightning zaps you. It's so you don't have to participate in the sin, and you don't have to stick around for the judgment in order to be there for someone, right? Just like if you want to reach out to someone who's struggling with alcoholism, doesn't mean that you have to go to the bar with them and get sloshed.
Right. Like I heard somebody when I was working in Virginia to say, oh, I go to the strip club to minister to them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, with that, that's pretty much the summation of chapter 12. All right. But now as we get into chapter 13, we learned that it wasn't very long after this military victory at Jabesh that King Saul, he really abandoned his noble ideas And from that point on, his righteousness or his godly leadership, it really starts to decline. We see this in that he really failed to keep this positive momentum going after this victory. As we see in chapter 13, one of the first things that Saul did was he disbanded his army that at the time had 30,300 men. And he kept only 3,000 troops active.
Right.
Now, of those 3,000, he kept 2,000 with him, and the rest, the other 1,000, he sent to be led by his son Jonathan in Gibeah.
Right.
Now, with only a third of this tiny force, Jonathan did something very interesting. He thought that it would be a good idea to attack Geba, which was a very well-equipped Philistine outpost deep in Israelite territory. One might ask the question. I didn't add this in the discussion questions because we don't have a good answer, but we can discuss it. Why would Jonathan do something like that? To assert his authority, maybe?
Well, I think he's a young man that tried to prove himself.
Yeah.
Well, I guess if you look at the geography of where this garrison was, it was right in the middle of Israel. And maybe John just got tired of the way the Philistines were acting and just wanted to get rid of them.
It could be, scripture is kind of silent on this, but so there's a few things that we can infer. His father was king, so maybe he had a little bit of overconfidence, thinking that he could do whatever he wanted and he wouldn't get in trouble, that his dad would come bail him out. Maybe that naivety and overconfidence, maybe it led him to think that even if a battle went poorly, that he wouldn't be killed because he was too important. I don't know.
Or his dad would bail him out.
Right, or his dad would bail him out. Right.
So I think I have a different take on it.
Okay.
I look at like, remember well, David hasn't come into the picture yet,
Correct.
but when David comes into the picture, he really feels this bond with David because David really believed in God. And I think Jonathan has a similar kind of faith in God. And in fact, in this little episode, remember he tells his armor bearer, okay, let's go there and show ourselves. If they tell us they're coming down to get us, that's fine. But if they tell us to come up and meet them, we'll take that as a sign from God that he is with us.
Right.
And so he has this faith,
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's definitely a possibility. There's a lot of options here, and it very well could be that, Jonathan was looking for, a quick and easy victory. This was just an outpost. It was a garrison, but it's not just about this small, outpost, this small garrison in the middle of Israel. It's about, the army that backs them. So here we see that the Philistine reaction was swift and it was very strong. They assembled a massive army equipped with 3,000 chariots, and the chariots were really invincible to Israelis' foot soldiers at the time. See, we have to remember at this point in history, the Israelites really didn't have a metalworking industry at all. They didn't have blacksmiths, they didn't have metal workers, so they weren't even equipped with swords or spears. They were incredibly outmatched, both in numbers, equipment, experience and strategy, and military leadership. They were no match. We're going to read a couple of verses about this here. Let's look at chapter 13, and we'll go to verses 3 through 7. chapter 13, verses 3 through 7. Anybody want to take that?
Well, I'll read it.
Okay.
Now Jonathan struck down the garrison of Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. So Saul blew the shofar throughout the country, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." All Israel heard the news. Saul had struck down the garrison of the Philistines, so Israel has become a stench to the Philistines. Then the people were summoned to Saul at Gilgal. One more?
Through 7.
Or through 7. Meanwhile, the Philistines assembled themselves to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They marched up and camped in Michmas, east of Beth Aven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble because their people were hard pressed, they hid in caves, thickets, cliffs, crevices, and pits. Some of the Hebrews even crossed over the Jordan to the land of God and Gilead. But as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal when all the people following him were trembling.
All right. Thanks for reading.
Mhm.
All right. So according to chapter 13, verses 3 and 4, who struck down the Philistines at Geba?
Jonathan.
Are you sure?
Mm,
Well, I'd say Saul.
Ooh. Are you sure? Is that your final answer?
No, I stick by Jonathan according to
They give
verse.
two different answers.
What's that, Melissa?
They give two different answers. In verse 3, it's Jonathan, and in verse 3, it's Saul.
That's right. In verse 3, it
And in
says
verse 4.
Jonathan, and in verse 4, it says Saul. So why do you think these verses give two different answers?
They work
Good
together.
question.
Well, it could be that Saul took the leadership, and therefore, since he sent Jonathan, he took responsibility for the action.
Yep, that's possible. Any other thoughts?
They were working together.
Oh, they were working together? Okay. It's possible. Yeah, probably. Based on the context, it seems as though Saul was unaware that this was happening. Or it seems that he was, it doesn't explicitly say that Saul gave authorization for this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was gonna say verse 3. Verse 3 says that Jonathan did it. Jonathan struck the garrison. 4 says Israel heard that Saul did it.
There's a rumor.
Right. Yes, exactly. All right. We're going to peel this onion back a little bit here. All right. So there's a couple possibilities. Some we've already discussed. Here as to why verse 3 tells us Jonathan attacked the Philistines, but verse 4 credits Saul. So one possibility comes from the notion that the king is ultimately responsible for the actions of his officers,
Exactly.
even if the king didn't specifically give the order. Now, this sentiment is also used with parents being responsible for the actions of their children. So we see that on multiple levels, Saul is ultimately responsible for what Jonathan does.
That's right.
Another possible explanation is that even though Saul was well known throughout the land, it's entirely likely that the people hadn't even heard of Jonathan in the same way. So compared to his father, the king, Jonathan was a nobody. So why are we going to say Jonathan did this thing? Like, Jonah who? Who are you talking about? Oh, but we know Saul. Okay. So the story got passed that Saul did it. There's a third possible explanation, which is kind of related to the last one, is that Saul's name was used to give the event more legitimacy. And this could be either by people meaning well or by people meaning to stir up a larger war. See, if the Philistines got word that the attack was carried out by Jonathan, they might have been able to be persuaded that he was not acting on the king's order. Perhaps restitution could have been been paid and an all-out war be avoided. But by attaching Saul's name to the attack, this type of plausible deniability became impossible for Saul and really eliminated the ability to try to pay restitution and avoid the war.
Right.
Now,
Yeah, I think Saul was taken by maybe not surprise, or he had to deal with a fait accompli, as we say.
Hmm.
And basically, it was Jonathan's doing, but Saul took responsibility.
yeah, could be. It doesn't really tell us for sure, so really we have to infer. And I don't think that there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but it's very interesting, to keep this in your mind when we're trying to get into the head of Saul, right? To see how these kings of Israel are behaving, what they're thinking, what their motivations are, and what their reasoning is.
Right.
All right, let's take a look back at verse 3, and I'll ask this. How did Saul summon his army this time? And how is that method different from how he summoned the army to defeat Jabesh? What was that?
He blew the trumpet.
Right, he blew the trumpet. You see that in verse 3?
Yeah, the shofar. Yep.
Right? Well, that's interesting because if you go back and you look at the siege at Jabesh, did Saul just blow a shofar and an army magically assembled?
Oh, he actually threatened.
He what?
He threatened the people of Joseph.
Exactly. So to defend Jabesh, Saul sent chopped up pieces of cattle to all the cities and threatened them to report for duty, or the same fate would befall their cattle. Not only that, it's actually implied. It doesn't state it explicitly, but it is implied that the people would fear that the same fate would befall them. But this time, he didn't have to send any threats. He'd proven his leadership and his military strategy to the people, and he earned their loyalty based on his leadership at Jabesh. So now he didn't have to make any threats. And the sound of the shofar was all the people needed to assemble. They were willing to go to battle for him, and they believed in his ability to lead them to victory.
Mhm.
Now, if we look at verses 6 and 7 again, what happened when the men of Israel saw the Philistine army amassing to attack them?
Well, they got scared, like in Egypt, when they went out and they saw the Egyptian after them. And the chariots were basically like the tank of those days.
Like the what?
The tank.
Oh, right, like the tank of those days. Right.
So basically, they had a large, tank unit, plus the horsemen, which were, I don't know what's comparable today, but, anyway, they got scared because they see a very well-equipped army and armed people against them.
Absolutely. What else?
They hid.
Yeah, what was that, Dottie?
I said they hid. So, they hid in different areas, like in the thickets, and they hid themselves.
That's right, Melissa. Yep, Melissa just said the same thing. They hid. They were cowards.
Chicken out.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, let's face it. I mean, if you were basically tribal, nomadic, and the closest thing to a spear that you had was a plow, right? And you see, you see a superpower, right, with chariots and tanks and everything, you'd probably run away too. Melissa's like, nope. Well, what else does this story of them running away and hiding, what else does that remind you of? Daniel gave one example.
Well, they didn't believe in the God of Abraham.
Who didn't?
The people who ran, they were living in the flesh and they ran because,
Oh, they,
yeah, unlike David, they believe in the power of God and they have faith. So even though the enemy looks like a giant, it doesn't deter them.
yeah,
But the Hebrew people were looking in this faith.
right. So there is a parallel to the story of David and Goliath, right? Yep. What else? Any other examples? What about the spies with Caleb and Joshua?
Well, they hid in the roof, but the girl hid them out of fear for their lives, and then they were spared, and she was spared. I don't know that that's exactly the same thing.
Sure. No, I was speaking more of to the part where, out of all the spies that went to search out the land, that all but two of them were afraid of what they saw, so afraid that they didn't want to fight. Right? They're like, nope, no, these dudes are way too big, way too strong. It's it's like going up against Arnold Schwarzenegger. We don't stand a chance. There's no point even fighting. And Caleb and Joshua were like, dude, what are you talking about, man? If God's on our side, who can be against us? Let's go. It's go time. So
But they had, I was just going to say, they had the belief and trust in God, and that's why they were willing to go. Where the other ones, they were just thinking in the human form, but not thinking of God being there with his power to help them.
Mm-hmm.
They were not focusing on God. What they should have been focusing on was God and trusting God to be the leader for them and give them the wisdom and strength.
Mm-hmm. You're right.
No, that was good. I'm typing some of the stuff up, the comments that you guys make that I don't have in my notes. And that's really good. You're right. So what we see here is that in all of these examples, it's actually the faith and belief in the power of God and trusting him to lead you that gives you courage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why in many ways verse 8 come up and they waited for Samuel. So they still look at him as the spiritual leader and they say it's okay, we cannot move without God's support.
Well, verse 8 is specifically speaking about Saul. Saul waited for Samuel. The people, when they heard the shofar, would have been, assembling and marching to where Saul was in Gilgal. Good.
Yeah, because in verse 8, it doesn't say anywhere, unless I missed it in the earlier reading, that Samuel told him to wait.
So it doesn't explicitly say here, but we know that conversation did happen because, we can look at verse 8. So he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, right? So we know that a conversation had happened or that Samuel sent a messenger. Okay, so we know that happened. So while all this was going on, right, we know Saul was waiting in Gilgal for Samuel to arrive so that Samuel could offer sacrifices and ask the Lord's blessing on this military venture. Now, many times before, God had given his people great victories, even when they were equally unmatched, right? Think of Gideon as well, is another good example. We see that this has happened with the modern nation of Israel as well, when the nation is attacked by 5, 6, 7 countries simultaneously. On the most holy day of the year, when everybody is, putting down their guns and in the temple, right, worshiping, and they were definitely outmatched in numbers and from multiple fronts, and God still delivered Israel. All right. So
But also, to me, that verse 8 remind me also of what happened with the golden calf. The people that, Moses delayed, and the people said, "Oh, we cannot go any further without our leader. Let's do our thing."
yeah, that's great.
Mhm.
No, definitely. So we see that, during the 7 days, as time passed, Israel soldiers, they see this brewing crisis, and they see the king's worried state, his body language. So these soldiers, they began to scatter. They began to go AWOL. And remember, this wasn't the 30,000 soldiers. This was of the 2,000 that Saul had left with him. So Saul is seeing his army evaporating before his eyes, and he's starting to panic. Let's read verses 8 through 10. And we'll see what happens there. I'll read that one. 8 through 10. So he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel had not come to Gilgal, so the people began to scatter from him. Then Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." So he offered the burnt offering. But as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to meet and greet him. So what was Samuel's response when he saw what Saul had done? And what's that, Melissa?
We haven't read that yet. But
Oh, right. You're right. So maybe here's a better question. I cut off our reading right there on purpose, right? So just put it in your mind, right? Samuel, right? The prophet, the priest who sent the message, "Hey, wait for me for 7 days." The same dude that said, "Oh, really, people of Israel? I'll summon, the heavens and have rain and thunder and come down and scare the what out of you." So he clearly has this direct line of communication with God, and God responds to him. So, that very same Samuel sends a message to Saul, "Wait for 7 days. I'll come and make an offering." So he waited the 7 days. He looks around and he's like, "Oh, I don't see him. I'll do it. No problem." And then as soon as he's done, he sees Samuel arrive. So it was still on that same 7th day, just as he said that he would going to do. Saul goes out to greet him. What do you think that conversation was going to be like?
well, the end of verse 10, it says that he might salute him. So I don't know if he was expecting praise from Samuel. "Hey, look what I did," thinking he was going to get an attaboy, when actually we're going to see that that's not what he gets. Yeah, that.
For me, the wife's like, "You dinner, but it's like."
Yeah, right. And yeah, exactly. There's a lot of modern examples we can use for this, right? Like when the husband comes home late from work, right? And he's thinking he's gonna get, "Hey, honey, I'm glad to see you home." When instead he gets, you missed dinner and soccer practice, and you were supposed to, do these other things, right? Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So we see that Saul is probably expecting a certain kind of response. It's not going to be the kind of response that he gets. That is for sure. Okay, so why don't we read a little bit of this, and we can see what happens. We're going to read just a couple verses here, 11 through 15. Anybody?
And Samuel asked, "What have you done?" Saul replied, because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you had not come with the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. I thought, I know the Philistines are about to advance against me at Gilgal, but I have not yet entreated Adonai. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly, but not keeping the commandment of Adonai your God, which he commanded for you. For now Adonai will have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingship will not last. Adonai has sought for himself a man after his own heart. So Adonai will appoint him as a ruler over the people, because you have not guarded what Adonai commanded you. Samuel then departed and went from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. Then Saul numbered the troops that were with him, about 600 men.
Wow. We lost 1,400.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a big deal, right?
Hmm.
This was probably not the response that he thought he was going to get. All right. So there's a couple of things that we read here. One of them is very interesting in verse 12, right? Where it says, so this is Saul giving his explanation, where he says, I thought they were about to advance against us, and I didn't yet go to the Lord, right? So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. What does that mean? Daniel, don't answer yet. What does that mean when it says, I forced myself and offered the burnt offering? Any thoughts? Oh, what was your thought, Melissa?
Aaron's son,
Aaron's sons?
they brought the strange fire on their own.
Oh, they brought the
They
strange
had,
fire on their own? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. It's definitely related here. What do you think Saul is trying to say, or what he means when he says, I forced myself and offered the burnt offering?
I was looking for a different word. Could it mean?
Well, I think he means that, he knew he was wrong. He didn't want to do it, but he forced himself to do it.
Yeah, it says
Yeah.
I became weak, or to become weak.
Become weak. Other translations say I felt compelled. Yeah. This one says, the ESV says I forced myself. The American Standard says I forced myself. This one says I took control myself. So he felt like he wasn't in control of the situation and he needed to control it himself. That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I know in the Hebrew it says lo chaliach.
So what?
Cholati.
I'm sorry, what?
What's the word there? Chalati.
The word for forced there is afak.
To become weak, or become sick. So he's, So I'm not sure how they got the word forced.
My one Bible, New King James says compelled. Therefore, I felt compelled.
Right. Yeah. So I mean the root means to contain, and so here it's the afak is really he couldn't restrain himself anymore. And I think that a better translation really is I felt compelled, right? Or he lacked control and he wanted to control it.
Right.
Yeah, because it also means the word to be grieved.
Okay.
Put pain or to make prayer, be sorry.
Yep. So we see the other thing that we see here is we see a number of consequences for Saul's sin in making the offering. All right. We can outline a couple of them, and you all tell me if there's anything that we miss. First, if we look at verse 13, we see that he lost the right to have his kingship established forever. Samuel told him, hey, if it wasn't for this, God was all set to establish your kingdom basically for all generations, right? That it wouldn't leave his family forever. So that was gone. Verses 13 and 14, we see that it tells us that the Lord is going to remove him from being king. So that's a little bit different, right? There's a little bit of a distinction between the kingship is not going to pass to your heirs and saying, oh, but you also are going to be fired. Okay. And that he would be replaced with a man after God's own heart. And that's a pretty important description there that we'll see when we get to David, right? Another consequence for this sin we see in verse 15. Samuel left him to deal with the Philistines on his own. You remember at Jabesh, Samuel was with him, was right alongside him. And even in this situation, wherever Samuel was, he sent a messenger or got word to Saul, hey, just wait for me and I will come to you. I will be with you. All right, so he did that. And after he saw what Saul did, he's like, man, I can't even be in your presence right now. I need to go. It's going to be bad. All right, does anybody see anything else that I missed? Just from these verses here. All right.
It's like Samuel is saying that there's no room for repentance. He's already condemning him without giving him an opportunity to repent.
Okay, that's interesting. So Melissa comments, it sounds like Samuel isn't giving any room for repentance, that he's already written him off. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. But I think that what we see here is that there's a physical consequence and there's also a spiritual consequence, right? Our actions have consequences in both the physical as well as the spiritual. So in this case, we see that he's going to probably get beat up pretty good, right? I mean, well, we haven't gotten that far yet, but that's the story that's building. We see that the physical punishment of losing the kingship, but we also see this spiritual consequence of no longer being under the protective umbrella that was being provided by Samuel and by extension, the Lord. So that's very interesting, because wasn't it just a few verses ago in chapter 12 that Samuel said, don't worry, Israel, I'm still going to pray for you. I'm not going to let God forsake you or anything like that. Don't worry, as long as you stop acting wicked. And the people repented, right? And here we are just a few verses later, and Samuel's like, really, guys? Really? I just can't right now. I just can't. So he's out of there for a little bit. We don't know if it's permanent or not. We'll have to see. All right. But now I want to ask. This is I think this is the last discussion question. Why did Samuel say that Saul's kingship would not last? Or let me rephrase, for what reason was given that Saul's kingship would not last?
That Saul proved himself not to be a man after God's own heart.
That's right.
Yes, that's true. There is.
Well, he didn't listen.
Right, he didn't listen. There's a specific reason. What'd you say, Melissa? Right, because you have not guarded what Adonai commanded you. It's the very end of verse 14. Okay, so we're going to look at this just a little bit more closely. All right, so Adonai will appoint him as ruler over his people because you have not guarded what Adonai commanded you. Okay, so verse 14 tells us the reason why. Now, the word used in this verse, where it says you have not guarded, that word in the Hebrew is shamar, shamer, and it means to hedge, to guard, to protect, to
That's the
attend.
same, I think it's the same word that's in the Aaronic benediction, right?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It also means to attend to or to take heed. It can also mean to observe, to preserve, or to reserve, or to save. I know. So I compiled a few other spots where this same word, the same Hebrew word is used, and we can look at those real quick here. Let me share it.
Yeah, like we're supposed to guard the Sabbath, right? The Sabbath day.
Absolutely. So here you see in Genesis 2:15 where it says God put man in the Garden of Eden to keep it. So here we see the word is being used to mean to attend to it. In Genesis 3:24, the Lord placed cherubims and the flaming sword to keep the tree of life, meaning to guard it. In Genesis 4:9, when Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" meaning, is it my job to attend to him?
Yes.
Yes, right. Genesis 28:15, behold, I am with you and I will watch over you wherever you go. Okay, so the word is used there to mean protection. Exodus 10:28, so Pharaoh said to him, go away from me, take heed never to see my face again. Okay, take heed, mean, I beseech you, it means, hey, listen up, pay attention. All right, Exodus 10:29, the very may I never see your face again. Next one, Exodus 12:17, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, means to do it, right? Here when we mean to, so there's more than one meaning of the word observe. Here it means to follow through with it, to partake in it. Exodus 13:10, you shall therefore keep this ordinance, right? In this season from year to year, it means to do. Exodus 23:21, watch for him and listen to his voice. This is the other meaning of to observe, not to do or to keep, but to physically watch. Use your senses and see what you can observe, see what you can watch. Numbers 6:24, the Lord bless you and keep you, like we said in the Aaronic benediction. Deuteronomy 6:12, watch yourself so that you do not forget Adonai. It means to guard, to be mindful, to be introspective. 1 Samuel 30:23, it is he who has protected us. Here again, we see the word means protection. In Job 24:15, it says the eye of the adulterer waits for twilight. So here the word is used in that negative connotation as to hold back or to reserve. And in Psalm 16:1, it says, keep me safe, O God, for in you I have found shelter. Means to preserve, right? Preserve me and to preserve my safety. Okay, so we see that word means a lot of different things. So now taking that into context, what can we take away from that when we look back at verse 14, where it says, because you have not guarded what Adonai commanded you?
Is he referring to Torah?
He is. He's also referring to, so he's not just referring to Torah in general, he's also referring to something very specific about the proper way to make offerings.
Right. And it's the same thing that God says to Abraham, I'm going to bless you because you're going to teach your son to keep my commandment, to shomer my commandment. So it's basically, so although we don't know what was the instruction, but there were instructions. And one of the instructions was to wait for Samuel, and he didn't.
Yep, absolutely.
We know what the instructions are. They're the ones that Samuel laid out for us.
Yeah,
That's
I know.
right.
Yeah, I
Melissa
know.
said, we know what the instructions are because they're the ones that Samuel laid out for the people from Torah. Yep, absolutely. What were you going to say, John?
How
I
this,
was just gonna say, sometimes when they're, we read the stories of people, and we can read how they, what they made their mistakes, and at the same time, you got to try to put yourself in Saul's place, because originally he had, 2,000 men around him, that were gonna fight whoever and do whatever needed to be done, and now all of a sudden there's, all these chariots, all these foot soldiers, all these cavalry people that are coming against him. Now he's down to 600 people, so, and he's panicking, and so that's why he rushed into this offering before waiting
Absolutely.
for Samuel. I mean, so he's not any different than any of us, looking at the dire straits around us, and, we're told to wait on the Lord, but I've made plenty of mistakes not waiting, not being patient, so, it's a never ending battle. So I just got to keep myself, when I read other people's problems, of being too judgy, because, oh, look at this, he's doing all this. And it's like, just like ranking all the people that left Egypt, we would never do that, we're just like them, so it's, and yeah, so it just tries to keep me from, it humbles me to know that even people that were chosen by God
right.
fail and panic and make rash decisions, but we just have to refocus ourselves back on who we're supposed to be listening to.
Yeah, but you know what? Even though Saul made the mistake, he still made a mistake to try and please God, try and still give offerings or serve the Lord. There's a lot of people that make mistakes and do their own thing.
So you're saying that it could have been worse, right? You think that there was some good intention there?
All I'm saying is that he still is trying to please God, even if it's ill-will.
So he's still trying to please God, even if it's ill-willed, or even if his methods are not the best.
Right.
I see some value in that, in Melissa's comment there, because what he could have done was he could have said, you know what? Samuel lied. He's not here. He betrayed us. You can't rely on this guy anymore. Pick up your pitchforks and, follow me and I'll lead you to victory. We don't even need to do offerings. Could have done that. And he didn't. Right? Okay.
It's almost like a horse being behind the, what is it, when you put something before the other,
Putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. It's kind of like he was getting ahead of where he should be.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, Melissa brought up a good thing earlier too about the two sons of Aaron, they wanted to please God. They wanted to, I don't know if they were trying to impress him or please him,
Well, they were drunk.
but they did their own thing, and they got zapped.
Yeah, they got zapped. Melissa's like, well, they were also drunk. So were they really trying to please him?
Mm.
Yeah.
Well,
You know-
according to the tradition, they had a zeal for God and they wanted to come closer to God, and they didn't do it the right way.
Could this have been a test of Saul by God and he failed? That, he should have waited on the Lord and trusted in the Lord. But he, at the last minute, he decided the flesh took over and he decided to take control of what he appeared a bad situation. But he failed the test.
Absolutely. Imagine if the people at Jabesh did the same thing, right? Where they said, hey, give us 7 days, right? Give us 7 days and then we'll see if we can fight. If not, we'll surrender. So 6 days come and pass and the army's not there yet, right? That night, they got word that Saul and his army were there, but say they didn't, on that, the sixth night was coming up and they could have very well said, you know what? Nobody's coming. We're doomed. Let's just start gouging out our own eyes now, right? I mean, they could have surrendered at that point, So this shows that even the people of Jabesh have more courage, intestinal fortitude than Saul, right? Right. Okay, so we see that they're greatly outnumbered in manpower and technology. And even Samuel has said, like, hey, dude, you're on your own. You're about to get zapped, and I don't want to be anywhere around you when this happens. We're going to close out just reading the last few verses of this chapter and see what happens here. Starting in verse 16 through the rest of the chapter. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people that were present with them were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines encamped in Michmas. Raiders started to come out from the camp of the Philistines in 3 detachments. One detachment turned towards Ophrah, to the land of Shual. Another detachment turned towards Beth Horon, and the third detachment turned towards the border road overlooking the Zeboim Wadi towards the wilderness. Now, no blacksmith could be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all the Israelites had to go down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his sickle, his axe, or his hoe. The price of sharpening was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the sickles, the 3-pronged forks or the axes, or to set the ox goads. So it came about on the day of battle, there were no sword or spear to be found in the hand of any of the troops that were with Saul and Jonathan. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Then the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmas, and then, well, it looks like we're out of time. So we're going to have to end here tonight, and we'll have to pick up again next week in chapter 14 and see what happens.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that Samuel threw up his hands and left Saul. But in 15, it says, Samuel then departed and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. But that's where Saul was, huh? Because in 16, he says, now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people that were present with them were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin. So I thought he was going away from Saul, but it looked like he went up to Saul.
Yeah, that could be. Let's see.
15 and 16.
Right. Okay.
So he left Gilgal and went to Gibeah.
Okay. Right, but we see that Saul and Samuel are having a conversation here, right? Starting in verse 8, and Saul was in Gilgal. Samuel had not come yet. Then he showed up. They had that conversation, and then in 15, Samuel departed from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin.
But then verse 16?
quite a ways, quite a distance.
15.
No, but they're in the same town.
Right,
No,
but
No.
So from Gilgal to
he departed.
Gilbea, it's pretty far away.
Yeah, but Saul and his son were staying in Gilbea.
Right.
Not
According to
at
16.
that point, they were in Gilgal.
right, so we see that the between verse 15 and verse 16, a lot of stuff happened in between there that isn't listed. Samuel had already left Gilgal. Saul and Jonathan were still there. And then in verse 16, we see magically Saul and Jonathan and the people were now in Gibeah again. So a journey had occurred. So they had actually
They went
picked
quite a
up
way.
and started like following Samuel.
Yeah, so they went from being east of Michmash all the way to south, being south of it. Yeah, it was quite a ways.
Yeah.
So probably try to catch up with Samuel.
Yep, probably did.
All right.
Are there any other questions or comments on any of this, what we went over today?
No, that's good.
Okay. All right. Well, I like to leave the cliffhanger in there, right? In case you don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe it'll encourage us to read ahead a little bit. For next week, we're going to discuss chapter 14 and try to get through 15 as well. There's some good stuff coming up, not just about what happens in the battle, but all of the ways in which Saul tries to prevent God from stepping in and saving them, with his foolishness. And then next week we'll, if we get through 14 and 15, we'll also start learning about, we'll start to see the end of Saul. We start to foretell his downfall. So that's kind of a little bit of foreshadowing of where we're going in the next week or two. All right, last chance for any questions or comments. Okay. All right. Rabbi, do you want to close us in prayer?
Sure. Father, we thank you for your presence. We thank you, Father, on your word, which is a lesson for us all. And help us, Father, to learn a lesson from our forefathers and to truly have emunah in you, in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Amen. All right. One thing that I did not go over in here is our chart on the narrative emphasis. If you remember, after the second week, we kind of filled in this box here. We're able now to fill in a little bit over here, but I'll pick up with that next week, and we can start filling that in with where we are. All right. So that's my bad that I didn't get to that today. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate it.